Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. It's an absolute pleasure to moderate this event, Connections Between Climate Change and COVID-19. My name is Barbara Buchner. I lead an advisory and analytic organization called Climate Policy Initiatives. We work with governments, with businesses, and with financial institutions to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. And we're known for tracking sustainable investment trends, for identifying innovative business models, and for supporting the solutions that can drive a transition towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. I have two excellent panelists joining me for this conversation today, each eminent in their fields. I'm looking forward to a very good discussion. But before turning to each of them for their perspectives, I first wanted to reflect a little bit on the topic of today, on the connections between climate change and COVID-19, and particularly the connections that challenge us and the path forward that we can see as we make our way through the pandemic. Globally, COVID-19 has claimed over 900,000 lives. These losses are absolutely terrible and saddening. But further, COVID has also laid bare the gaps in society and government's ability to address them in terms of social safety nets and weak points in the economy impacting the world's most vulnerable. Today, governments globally are rolling out plans and cash for economic stimulus and for enhancing social safety nets. And while I believe we can all agree that rescue must first and foremost focus on addressing the health issues, it's also absolutely crucial that governments and other actors focus this recovery phase on building social, economic, and financial resilience to be better prepared for the climate crisis that will be bigger in every way and stay with us over a much longer period of time. While COVID has terribly claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, estimates from experts around the world foresee that these numbers rise to the 100-fold over the next decade should the world continue post-COVID into a business-as-usual pathway with emissions rising at their current levels. So stemming the next crisis means that mainstreaming climate action into regular decision-making is the need of the day. We must continue ambitious action on climate change as the world recovers from the pandemic, particularly as trillions are spent on economic stimulus. The question is how. My institution, Climate Policy Initiative, has been at the forefront of bringing forth policy and financial solutions for green recovery. So let me briefly focus on three key ingredients emerging from that work. First, we're seeing very clearly that good policies lead the way. They're key to resourcing a sustainable and resilient recovery. Green fiscal policies like pricing carbon, like reforming fossil fuel subsidies and procurement policies and green budgeting can be an important ingredient in a government's COVID-19 response toolkit. Why? Such approaches can really help countries removing inefficiencies in public expenditures and raising additional revenues, which can be directed towards immediate relief measures while supporting also medium to long-term sustainable recovery planning aligned with climate objectives. Second, it is clear in the wake of COVID that we need to use public finance even more wisely than ever before. With competing demands on public finance and rapid recovery needed, development financial institutions in particular have a major role to play. Development banks and the international financial institutions can help build strategy and support policy development. They can deploy a wide range of instruments to manage, to share, and to reduce risk. They can convene relevant stakeholders and decision makers across the public and private sectors. And through these activities, they can greatly enhance what the private sector can do. So expanding their role in the post-COVID world is likely to be one of the cheapest and lowest risk ways to get low-cost finance to the green recovery and to climate action. And third, we need to reset the whole financial system. Now, with the shocks to the financial system and the real economy worldwide much more clearly highlighted through the COVID crisis, it is a time when we are increasingly seeing central banks and regulators also looking to this next crisis. So for example, we've seen the Reserve Bank of India that just made a statement to this effect for the first time in their annual report, And the People's Bank of China has announced it will begin to grade banks on their green finance performance quarterly starting next year. So this is the moment in which all financial institutions need to ultimately align their portfolios with a better future, strong, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. There is an urgent need to shift the entire financial system to better respond to and help reduce and manage both physical and transition risks triggered by climate change, as well as to standardize related disclosure. Towards this end, CPI is joining forces with the European Climate Foundation and with Oxford University to facilitate the development of principles for financing a sustainable recovery. These principles are intended to provide a framework shared by governments, by public banks, private sector, academia, and civil society organizations to ensure that public and private bailout and recovery finance is purposely aligned with the SDGs and with the climate objectives of the Paris Agreement, as well as its associated regional objectives, such as the EU 2050 net zero objectives. Governance, of course, is paramount, and in fact, the coverage of the principles and the associated signatories are expected to include ministries of finance, central banks, regulators, multilateral and national development banks, as well as commercial financial institutions. It's only when all players and all overseers are aligned that we will really see funding for an opportunity and for an urgent need to help countries align their economies to those envisioned under the Paris Agreement and their own national determined contributions, including adapting to the future shocks, to be courtesy of climate change. So as we look to the recovery, we do have a window to rebuild our world for a more inclusive, more resilient, more sustainable future, targeting both short-term economic recovery and long-term structural changes aligned with sustainable inclusive growth and with strengthening the society's resilience. However, not doing so would pose a significant threat to sustainable recovery and to the world as we know it. So we need to act now, and there's a risk that this window that we have at the moment to build this better world will be closing soon. So I look very much forward to discussing these issues now with my panelists. Let me turn now to my esteemed panel, where I have joining me two incredible speakers. And I will keep the introduction short since their bios are in the conference program book. But let me first welcome Christiana Figueres, who is author and the former executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Christiana, it's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for the invite.
And let me also welcome Dr. Erin Bernstein, who is the interim director of the Center for Climate Health and the Global Environment at Harvard. Erin, it's a pleasure having you as part of this conversation.
Delighted to be with you.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's get started. So Christiana, let me start with you. I've just finished reading your book, and I can just highly recommend it to everyone here. But in your book, The Future We Choose, you outline two possible scenarios for our planet. One, if we fail to meet the Paris climate targets, and one where we manage to transform into a carbon neutral regenerative world. And you describe the changes in the mindset that are needed to shift our action from self-centric to nature-aligned, and you also argue for confronting the climate crisis head-on with determination and optimism, laying out 10 concrete actions. Can you tell us a little bit more what you think is most important for each of us to do, and also whether the COVID pandemic has changed any of your recommendations or priorities? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. So first of all, I totally agree with you that we have an extraordinary opportunity and responsibility right now to make sure that the recovery packages align with the longer term goals, both the SDGs and the climate Paris Agreement, because as you have said, if we don't, we will simply not have the resources. As we know, we have $12 to $20 trillion already in recovery packages, and the world has never seen that amount of money being injected into the global economy, and that will determine the carbon intensity of the global economy, not for a few months, but actually for a few decades, if not longer. So I completely agree with you that the crises have now converged. We didn't ask for the convergence of the health crisis, the economic crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and the social inequity crisis. They have converged, and hence it is our responsibility to make the solutions converge, because we cannot address them sequentially. We have run out of time, and we will soon run out of money if we do it sequentially. So fortunately, we can actually address them all as a package, and use this as a crisis that leads to a huge opportunity. So I completely agree with your analysis, and thank you for your steps that you're moving forward with, giving some concrete guidance about how to do these recovery packages responsibly. Now, you've asked me what we can do. Well, as you and your institution and the ones that you worked with have already demonstrated, the first step is to get out of the gloom and doom box. Unfortunately, too many people are stuck in that box, and despair leads to paralysis. And then we don't do anything in terms of moving us out. So that, of course, does not mean deny the science. It doesn't mean deny the effects of what we're already seeing. For example, the terrible fires now in California, after the terrible fires in Australia. It means to be steeped in the reality and the science, but certainly not limited by the reality that we're seeing today. It means that we have to decide that we do have the ingenuity, we have the capital, we have the technology, and we know what the policies are to avoid the worst. But more excitingly, not only can we avoid the worst impacts that are projected by science quite rightfully, but we can actually build a much better world than the one that we have right now. It can be a world that is regenerated, that is healthier, has much better quality air, that is more just, that is more stable. So the first step is to get out of the doom and gloom box and set our minds to how are we going to solve it? Not can we solve this, but how are we going to? The second step is to make it personal, to really accept that we all have a personal responsibility and a personal role to play in this. Because if we impersonalize it, we're not going to get to it with the passion and the depth that we need to. So we need to make it personal and understand that each of us has the responsibility to decarbonize our carbon footprint by 1/2 over the next 10 years, as well as decarbonizing the entire economy, the entire global economy, by 1/2 by 2030, but also all of the smaller jurisdictions over which we have influence, whether that is the philanthropy investments that you're making, whether that is your city, your state, your country, whatever influence you have. We have to be able to make it personal, assume personal responsibility, and go to scale. Because if we don't go to scale, then we stay in the playground area where we're just doing little pilot projects, and we've run out of time for that. So get out of the doom and gloom, decide that you're going to contribute very clearly and with determination. I call it stubborn optimism, just in case, so that we know that it has to be gritty. Make it personal and go to scale would be my steps.
Fantastic. And I couldn't agree more with you, Christian. I think particularly to make it personal, I think is really an important part, because I think, again, we've been working all in this sphere for a long time, but I think you really gotta make it personal. And I think, again, you've been talking about the wildfires. I know, and some of our colleagues on the call here are also based in California, where I am today. And again, I have to say, like, once you're like in the middle of the actual implications of climate change and you realize what it does to our planet, I think you really gotta step up and like make it personal, and ultimately, hopefully, that will get us to the scale needed. But thanks also for already kind of like, outlining a little bit that all the crises are converging. So let me go to Aaron, to Brinton. You are an established medical professional. You're leading on health and climate-related global environmental issues. But we obviously know now also from some of the public opinion research that the COVID crisis has awoken the public also to the serious nature of climate change. These two challenges being very often compared by experts in this field, both for the magnitude and the scale of both of the crises. So just from your perspective, is it accurate to compare the two? How do you see that these two crises are linked? How are they different in either the magnitude or the effect? And is there anything that you think we can learn from dealing with COVID that we can take forward to this next crisis? So over to you.
Well, thanks for that question, Barbara. And I should say at the outset that most of what I have to say, if not all, was probably said better by Christiana just a moment ago. I think that, the convergence of the crises she made abundantly clear, which is, the coronavirus pandemic has put on the table that we have this enormous amount of capital being, flowing into economies, and what we do with that capital is going to shape progress on climate change. So they're linked in that way, and we have to get out of doom and gloom. We have to be able to talk about benefits. So let me talk about some of the lessons that I think we might benefit from taking from these experiences a bit more detail. The first, Christiana alluded to, and Barbara, you alluded to, which is we allow inequalities to fester in society. There are racial inequalities, there are economic inequalities, there are other forms of inequalities, and that's a tolerance we can no longer afford. And it is, whether you look at the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, as Christiana has talked about, these converging crises, all of these course through the fault lines that inequality creates. So coronavirus thrives on inequality, the climate crisis thrives on inequality, the biodiversity crisis really thrives on inequality. And so when we take actions that address one of these things in particular, we can actually address inequalities. And it's a critical point. And in doing so, you have potentially pandemic solutions as climate solutions, as solutions that promote equity. So to get at that more specifically, a group of folks, including myself, got together and said, what would it take as an investment to prevent pandemics like the current one? How much would we have to spend? So if you look at the places in the world where pandemics like coronavirus tend to emerge, they happen to be often in tropics, often in forests. And preventing deforestation is a cornerstone of preventing pandemics. We also, of course, need to look at wildlife trade. We need to look at wildlife capture and biodiversity loss more broadly. But we put together a suite of packages that would really get at the root cause, the spillover of pathogens into people. And if we spent what our best estimates were to do that, it would be about $20 or $30 billion a year. You spend that amount for a decade, and you're still only talking about 1% to 2% of the 10 trillion plus that's being spent on coronavirus. And the short news of that is salvation comes cheap. And if there were ever a moment in time in recent history where, the reality of taking these actions that get at root causes, conferring, benefits that we simply can't refuse, I don't know what it is. So sure, coronavirus does have the potential to make disparities worse. It can derail progress on climate. But the reality is that when we show how much we stand to gain, particularly in things that have broad-based appeal, these issues around inequality and certainly climate, remember, deforestation is a huge part of our carbon problem. We simply can't refuse to take up these offers. The last thing I'll say about lessons we need to learn is that we have to play the long game, as Christiana described it. We have to keep in mind what the science tells us about where we need to go. But we also need to be mindful of the short game. And I actually think we've gotten, in some ways, in the carbon space, to most people, and this comes from my experience as a clinician, when I'm talking to people who come to see me because their child is sick, they want to figure out what's going to matter to them to make this child better right now. And so if we're going to get enough people motivated to the point where we see the transformational change we need to remember that climate actions matter to people's health today in ways that will make pregnancies turn out better, keep people having heart attacks, save children's brains, save the brains of the elderly, prevent cancers. All of these things the science shows us are the benefits of preventing air pollution that comes from burning fossil fuel. And we know, of course, that those pollutants disproportionately affect people of color in the United States, the poor around the world. And so we may have put the cart before the horse. We call these things co-benefits, when the reality is these are the benefits. These are the things that people care about right now. And the more we talk about them as co-benefits, we're pretending as if they're less important. In fact, they're more important. In fact, to most people, understandably, they want to save the health of themselves and their families today. And of course, they want to save the planet and life on Earth for everyone in future generations, but we all obviously need to take care of ourselves first. And so I think it's one of the things coronavirus makes clear is that when a pandemic hits, and this is not going to be the last pandemic, if we're going to maintain focus on climate change, we need to be able to connect climate action to the near term. And that's why when we talk about the green recovery, Barbara, and your plans, you have to talk about the health effects of these investments. We're working with financial firms right now who are focused on sustainability and carbon, but we have to talk about how those investments are going to affect air quality. And here's a really good example. In the United States, and I'll give the example in the world. In the United States, you can make the same carbon benefit by putting renewables, whether it's wind or solar, or pick your favorite, anywhere. It just depends on how much sun, how much wind, how much water, et cetera, you've got. But those same carbon benefits have wildly different effects on health. Turns out in the United States, if you're going to site renewables, you're going to save the most lives if you site those renewables in the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes, many full times. In the world, if you look at a national basis, we save the most lives if we put renewables in India. Same amount of carbon is saved, but more lives will be saved. More people will not develop asthma, will not die of pneumonia. And let's be clear, another connection between coronavirus and fossil fuels and climate is the air pollution story, where we have this evidence that long-term exposure to air pollution is increasing the risk of people dying from the disease. So we have to integrate health into the frameworks about the green recovery. We have to focus on the disparities associated with those health impacts. And we have to think about how those things matter to people's view of the actions we might take towards carbon. Because I tell you, if we can tell people that the carbon problem is going to be fixed, that's great. If we can tell them that their child isn't going to have to go to the hospital with an asthma attack, their elder is not going to have to go die from pneumonia unnecessarily, boy, they're going to be way more motivated to get there.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that. I think very powerful messages here. And I think really right. I mean, we have to rethink the overall, the framework, the narrative, the language also we're using, and really highlight what are the overall benefits from investing, into a sustainable recovery, but like showing how the impacts are today. So I think that's very powerful. And certainly I think your point on also preventing deforestation, I think is certainly something that we would all agree that this is something that, we got to think about some of where do we have the highest impact? What are the actions that we can do today in order to have the highest impact, including by looking at them, obviously, making sure that we're preventing deforestation. I have some follow-up questions now, Christiana, for both of you. Just also like telling the audience that we would love to get your questions as well. I'm be happy to integrate them in our conversation here. So please use the platform to post questions as we are having another round here now between us. But we'd love to hear your thoughts and your questions as well. But Christiana, let's go back a little bit. I mean, it's clear that the challenges are significant. We started already talking a little bit about the solutions, and you also in your work, when you've been leading and guiding the UNFCCC, you have always highlighted the transformational potential that sustainable energy offers. But I'd love to hear a little bit now, given the gaps and the issues you're seeing, we have been exposed in the wake of COVID. What can we be doing in order to close the energy access gap, but also, the water gap, the biodiversity gap? How are all these sustainable development goals linked? And what are some of the solutions that you see that are actionable even today that we could really try to foster more?
Well, first, let me say I enthusiastically support every single word that Aaron said, because if we do not humanize climate change, if we continue to talk about climate change in terms of megatons and I don't know what else, and just numbers and charts and temperatures, we're just going to get nowhere. So I very much appreciate that argument. The fact that we're losing 7 million lives prematurely to air pollution is just unforgivable. Why are we still doing that in 2020? So I totally agree. And in answer to your question, Barbara, let me actually, because Aaron used the example of India, let me actually dive down there into Delhi. Because Delhi has the worst air quality numbers in the world, which is why Aaron says put renewable energy in India. And Delhi also has, or not just Delhi, India has the most incredible concentration of two-wheel vehicles. So 80% of all of the vehicles in India are two-wheelers, and all of them burn fossil fuels through an internal combustion engine. So that is primarily responsible for the air pollution in New Delhi. That means that if you live in Delhi, you have 6 years, statistically, you will live 6 years less than if you live anywhere else, just because of the air pollution. So that's why Aaron is saying, put renewable energy into India, specifically in Delhi. Now, the amazing thing is that Delhi has been the city that has championed a completely innovative business model for electrifying vehicles, for electrifying motorcycles. And they are now have the commitment to move all of those two-wheelers, those motorcycles, over to electric motorcycles through a very innovative business model that removes the battery, which is the expensive part, from the cost of the motorcycle, and puts batteries into what used to be gas stations, because I'm already thinking in the future. And you just go and pick up your battery and use it, and then you return it and pick up a full one when you have depleted the battery. So what that is doing is it is bringing access to these solutions way down to the bottom of the pyramid. Because if it's only people who, do sophisticated things, buy Teslas or whatever, that's not going to get us anywhere. And it doesn't help to close the inequality gap. And it doesn't help us with public health. So we have to be able to open the floodgates of access to renewable energy, to electrified vehicles, especially for the millions of people who are depending on that and need to continue their economic growth, but can switch over to clean energy. And renewable energy is actually, that is what they do, because they're so easily deployable. You can put small solar panels on any single small house anywhere in the world, and then you can electrify a home. And to be able to bring electricity, clean electricity, renewable electricity, to all the 800 million people who still do not have electricity. We have to give them electricity, because that is at the bottom of their development. And with electricity, they will be able to pump water and to filter their water. So it all starts with having some basic electricity at home. But if they're going to do that through extension of the grid and fossil fuel plants, then we have done nothing for climate. So we have to be able to see all of this in their interrelated connections, and be able to invent new business models that allow especially the millions of people to be able to access, whether it is an electric vehicle that is clean and cheap, or whether it is renewable energy for their homes. It is very similar, if I can say, to the jump that we all made from landlines to cell phones. It's simply cheaper and much more user-friendly to have a cell phone. It is cheaper and much more user-friendly to have renewable energy solutions. And so we have to get that into our mind. This is no longer a huge burden, a huge cost, a huge punishment that we're paying for previous sins. The economics are on our side. This is the good news. We can bring the solutions of climate change to the masses and thereby improve health.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Christiana, for that. And again, I think I'm very happy also you talked about that example. I think it might actually even come out of one incubator that we're at the moment managing, which is called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. We have been trying with a specific program for India, which we hope we will be scaling up, because I fully agree with both of you that, we need to really find the solutions, particularly in the countries, where the needs are highest. But through this lab, what we do is we focus exactly on innovative business models that can ultimately unlock private investment, and but making it in a way that we look all at the co-benefits, which clearly we should not call co-benefits anymore. But I think it's exactly that what you do. Try to find new financing solutions business models that really can bring renewable energy, that can bring the solutions, across all the different sectors, from energy to adaptation to water to the country. So I'm excited that you're talking about that. But I think I want to stress one point that you made, is like, really the economics are on our side. I think couldn't agree more. I mean, it is not, in almost all parts of the world, fossil fuels are not competitive anymore. Renewables are much cheaper. So it's something we really need to focus also on, the phasing out of the support for fossil fuels. And I really want to make a plea here for that, because I think in saying that, talking to a colleague, we always say, when you're on a diet, you can't just only count the salad, you also have to count the ice cream. And it feels like, we're getting more and more salads, more and more renewable energy, but at the same time, we're also seeing still the world to be addicted to ice cream, and we're still heavily investing in fossil fuels. And I think we need to really be much loud and more pronounced about these issues. But let me go back, Erin, to you. And I think what I've heard from you already, talking about inequality, I think as we talk about sustainable development, it's clear from both the COVID crisis and also what we expect of climate change, that there needs to be this increased focus on those who are most vulnerable. So that might include marginalized groups, women, children, the elderly, refugees, and others. And so just to highlight one specific example here of the many impacts that climate change will have, increasing temperatures resulting in extreme heat certainly are going to be a silent killer. And I know that you support the Arch Rockefeller Resilience Center's Extreme Heat Resilience Initiative, a mouthful, and in fact have been appointed a senior fellow at the center recently. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit more how big this problem is going to be, and what has COVID again shown us in terms of the gaps in our being prepared to deal with this as a society. So back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Barbara. I think it is important to talk about heat, because in the scope of what climate change means for health, we easily latch on to other things and forget that the primary signal from climate change we see on the planet is warming. And from a scientific standpoint, that's probably the easiest to look down the road and see what's coming. And what we see is coming is something we need to do a lot more to prepare for. Many people know that heat can increase the risk of dying on any given day. But it turns out that heat matters to lots of other things that I care about, and as a doctor, and obviously everyone else does too. But there's robust research showing that heat, for example, is associated with suicide risk. And it's probably associated with violent crime. Heat is increasingly a risk factor for bad pregnancy outcomes. There's evidence, for example, that heat probably increases the risk of heart defects in fetuses. And so the more we focus on heat, the more we realize it isn't just about people who, when people started first looking at heat as a risk for health, people said, oh, it's just people who are about to die anyway, and the heat just sort of pushed them on the edge. Well, we learned pretty quickly that that's not true. Heat waves kill people who would not have otherwise died. And then you look short of that, and we realize that so many people's health is at stake in ways we're just really starting to understand. And then you realize, and this is where my doctor life comes in, our bodies were designed to dissipate heat, right? We can do all kinds of things. We can dilate our blood vessels. We behaviorally, we go in places that we know are cooler. We might turn a fan on. If we have air conditioning, we might do that. And we sweat. And so all of our biological mechanisms to deal with heat were trained in a climate era we're no longer in. And people have settled in places and adapted to the climate regimes of those places at the cusp of where we can physiologically adapt. And so as we look down the future, we see maybe 20% of the people on Earth living in places today, if they stayed there, they're going to be too hot to be outside and be safe, right? And so I'm looking at that and I'm saying, okay, we need to get our act together about what we're going to do here. And that's particularly true in low and middle income countries, where we have large numbers of people living around cities that have very marginal access to shelter, water, and certainly not air conditioning. And so we're really trying to push forward on protecting those folks, because you know what? Those are exactly the folks that are going to be first affected by, you guessed it, coronavirus. Yep. And they are going to suffer the most. And they are driving not only in many cases the economic engines of countries, but the creative enterprises. I mean, Christiana referenced this story of the batteries in India, and I don't know who invented it, but I expect that it's people living probably on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum because they see the reality of what it's going to take to move forward. They recognize the challenges. And we see this time and again in work we've done in global health. The innovations that have really driven gains in global health almost always come from the people who are face to face with the problem that we're all concerned about, but they understand the resource space, they understand the local concerns, and they drive the ideas that lead to the gains for broader society. So there are real connections here. I just want to be clear, though, about with heat. Right now, from a scientific standpoint, we know heat does all those things I talked about, but it varies based upon where in the world we are. So a 90-degree day, in Boston, or a 30 degrees Celsius day in Boston is wildly different than a similar day in Miami or Delhi, or pick your favorite city around the world. And we need to have a much better understanding of what that risk is so that we can actually protect people. Turns out, we know that in most places when heat warnings are given, people are getting sick well before that, particularly people who are most at risk. So we need that science. And we especially need to understand what will work to protect people, because the general idea now, and this gets back to the interface between the pandemic and climate and heat, is air conditioning. We want to give everybody air conditioning. Well, that's a viable solution if you, one, have the money, two, have the electricity supplies to do it, and the built environment to support it. But if you're pushing fossil fuels to power all that air conditioning, you're going to create a huge air pollution burden at a time when air quality is almost always, when there's heat, going to be worse. And that's not good for, and let's be clear, it's not just coronavirus, folks, that's bad with air pollution. Under 5 mortality in the world is driven by lower respiratory tract infections, meaning pneumonias. And the lion's share, maybe 34% of those, are from air pollution. If those children hadn't been dosed with air pollution, they wouldn't have gotten that pneumonia and they wouldn't be dead. So, again, this is what I was talking about in my first remarks, is that the more you realize how climate solutions can drive gains broadly, particularly through disease burdens that are enormous and hard to get at through people like me in a clinic, you realize we can't afford not to do these things. But the problem is we don't look at health. We look at carbon flows, we look at warming potentials, we look at green finance from a carbon standpoint. But Christiana was talking about a new business model. What if, and here's a vision for the future, what if the business investments, the investments in products, the investments in commodities, didn't just look at carbon and water, which, among other sustainability goals, which are huge and critically important? What if they actually looked at what those things meant to the health of the people they were affecting? How would that transform people's investment portfolios and their business strategies? And the great news is, as I pointed out, is that you can't do those things without benefiting the climate readily. Right? Now, you shouldn't forget about the sustainability goals, because we need to be mindful of those. And I think Christiana articulated that clearly. But I think we're going to get the momentum we need much faster when we give people the bird in the hand.
Fantastic. Again, I think couldn't agree more. And I'm already thinking, we are doing this annual tracking climate finance flows. I'm already thinking about how we could expand that to actually look at the impacts on health, and really kind of making sure that you get a better, more comprehensive, more holistic understanding of what this, what the impacts of solutions are. But I think very powerful. I think looking at climate solutions, which can really kind of drive the gains more broadly. So thanks so much for that. We have 2 quick questions from the audience, one for each of you actually, which is very nicely. We have the first one, Christiana, to you, a question of, is there something I can do today, this week, start renewing my own carbon footprint, or empower my friends or colleagues to do the same? And then Aaron, for you, there is a question around whether there are ways that education campaigns which have worked for public health can also work to change behaviors that contribute to climate change. So again, how can we make that really personal on a global scale? But first, Christiana, back to you on what we can do today to change our behavior.
Yeah, actually, pretty simple to start your first and take your first step. So go to Miss Google, as I call her, and type in carbon calculator, and up comes a long list of carbon calculators that if you just choose whichever institution you trust the most, and they're all great there, go into the carbon calculator and they'll ask you certain questions. And by the end, when you've finished answering the questions, you will know what your personal carbon footprint is, depending on whether you answer the questions for yourself as an individual or your family or your city or your community or whichever boundary you want to draw around the answers to those questions. But it's important for us all to have, at least as a starting line, to know what our carbon footprint is. It's interesting that we check our bank accounts at least once a week, if not more often, but we have no idea what our carbon account is. And the carbon account has actually much more impact on everybody's quality of life. So the first thing is to establish, where do you start? Without blaming yourself, those people who live in the United States will be substantially higher than people who live in India. But you don't have to blame yourself. That's, the way it is. It's, instead of blaming yourself, figure out what your starting line is, and then figure out how you're going to reduce that. And you will be able to identify where your biggest emissions are through the questions that are asked, because they'll ask you about, how you heat and cool your homes, how you, or your office, how you transport yourself, what kind of energy you buy. And so it'll be very evident where your greatest emissions are. And then you can make a plan. Honestly, every single person listening to this can totally reduce their emissions by 1/2 over the next 10 years, if not over the next 5 years. We can all do it, because at some point you're going to replace your boiler. You can definitely increase the efficiency of your windows, your roof, your basement. You can definitely improve the way that you transport yourself. You can definitely stop eating red meat. You don't have to do it from Sunday to Monday, but piece by piece, you can say, okay, right, I'm going to do meatless Monday, as is famously put out there. And then try to not eat red meat on alternative days until you get to the point where you don't need to eat red meat, honestly. And it's much better for our health, as Aaron would point out. It's much better for our health not to consume red meat. And it's much better for the health of the planet. Again, this overlap that is so important. So figure out what your carbon footprint is, figure out where your major emissions are, identify where the low-hanging fruit is. What can you do this year, before this year is out? What can you do? And then set out your plan. How are you going to get to 1/2 of your current emissions? If you live in the United States, you're probably at about 20 tons of emissions per person, compared to India, which is 2 tons. So there you go. But you can definitely, if you're at 20 today, you can be at 10. If you're at 40 today, you can definitely be at 20. We can all reduce our emissions by 1/2, and we all have to. The global economy has to cut its emissions by 1/2 by 2030 if we want any fighting chance of being able to live in a thriving economy and a stable, natural environment. If we don't do that, we don't have any possibility. We can kiss it goodbye, because we will be in a world of constant destruction and increasing human misery. And that's not the world that we want for ourselves or for our kids. So this is doable. This is totally doable.
Great. Thanks so much, Christiana. So that's, I think, very strong call for action for all of us. And back to you, Aaron, now just on how maybe education campaigns could help in this context, if there's any lessons you have.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I've so little hair, and what hair I have is gray. And if that's any reflection of anything, I may have been talking about climate change and health longer than anybody to students. And we're in the middle of a course that has been taken by over 100,000 students on climate change and health in over 100 countries. So I've also gotten a lot of feedback. And so what I would say is that I really do mean what I said about solutions and where they tend to come from. And that's what I've learned in education as well. When you talk about climate change and health to bright, motivated, I mean, there's no question that my ability to engage in what is a very difficult subject over the long term has a lot to do with the energy and optimism and drive of the students I work with all the time. And they're constantly showing me where I can do better. So, the first point is, and I learned this some years ago, is, we started our course. The course started at Harvard Medical School in the late 90s. It was the first course on global environmental change. I was not the course director back then. But we talked about the science of climate change, and we talked about health, because at that point, health was the sort of, wow, it's not about polar bears. You could talk about people. That's sort of an interesting idea. And we talked a lot about the problems, and we got very into not just, it became, just this past week, I had a paper rejected because it made the assertion that climate change affected every organ system. And one of my MD colleagues couldn't believe that was possibly true. And I get, and this is the kind of feedback I've gotten and learned from. But, we learned that climate change really does, there's no part of our body that's spared. There's no person who's spared. And students immediately latched on, it's not we get that health is a problem, but you need to talk about the people who are affected. Like, who are they? The equity concerns, the north-south divides, and almost intuitively, and I can't, in retrospect, it's not clear, but it might have been from their own learning up to the point of taking the course. They knew that if you look at any society in the world and what drives the understanding of right or wrong in those societies, every society is fundamentally concerned with equity. You will not find a society where you say, some people worse off, some people better off. That's fine. And so by showing that was the first thing, is that you understand that this is not a challenge unique or specific to one group of people, but the dynamics of it show that there are near-term equity issues, like with air pollution. There are intergenerational equity solutions, i.e. the people of today are living in a very different place, as Christiana alluded to, than would be the future if we fail to act. That empowers people with grandchildren. They think to themselves, I might not have so many years left to live. Do I really want to die knowing that I didn't act to protect the welfare of my grandchildren? It certainly empowers new parents. The next big lesson came after we talked about the problems and who was affected. Of course, there was a tipping point, and you both have alluded to this, is that it would be one thing if we were sitting here facing the climate crisis and there's nothing to do about it. If we didn't have renewables that were affordable, if we didn't understand the nature of the problem, we'd be in a much different place. In medicine, those are the problems we can't stand. We have these problems in medicine which we understand how they work in every which form, but we have no solution. And I would much rather be in a situation where we understood nothing about the problem but knew how to cure it. Well, in the case of climate change, we have both. We know what the problem is, how it works, and what we need to do about it. And so the students said, okay, tell us about the solutions. We get the problems, talk about the solutions. And so they really, to Christiana's point, they didn't want to hear about the doom and gloom anymore. They barely wanted to hear about the science anymore because they've been taught it, they know it. They want to learn about what people are doing to fix it. And that's critical, not just to stimulate conversations about what the right path forward is, but one of the things that's been put out there about those who would have us not do what we need to do is, well, the climate change folks, they're just a bunch of doomsdayers. And all they do is talk about doom and gloom. And that makes people want to jump off cliffs. It's irresponsible, in fact, that they're talking about the stuff. And, the surveys they point to saying how many people in the world are concerned. Well, maybe they're justifiably concerned because not only do they see the problems, but they see the inaction associated with it. I can tell you, again, from being a doctor, and you don't have to be a doctor to know this, when you tell a parent a terrible diagnosis, and then you tell them we can cure it, like childhood leukemia is a great example. When I started practicing childhood leukemia, it was somewhat curable. Before I started practicing childhood leukemia, the most common forms are 100% lethal. In some parts of the world, we barely are able to treat it, and it's still that way. Today, the most common forms of childhood cancer are almost 100% curable. I can tell that mother, it's usually a mother, sorry, dads, but it's usually a mother, terrible diagnosis, but we can cure this. Versus terrible diagnosis, we have nothing we can do. And the last thing I've learned, and this is again from the students, is if you understand the problem, you understand the solutions, and you understand who it affects, that's actually not enough to fix this problem. because we know all that and we're not doing enough. So you have to understand what's going to motivate people to do something. And that's why our center is so squarely focused on the near-term health effects, because we know, not just from experience, but from science, that these are the arguments that transform climate change from a political problem into a personal problem that you can do something about. And so those are the things I would say. And that's as true for COVID as it is for climate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Aaron. I know we are like 5 minutes over. I know Christiana has a hard stop. So let me actually just very briefly just sum up the main takeaways from this fascinating conversation. I want to thank my two panelists very much. I think very clear we are at the moment where there is the convergence of the crisis. We got to get out of the doom and gloom box, make it personal, and get to scale. How? Again, I think we've heard here in this conversation that we've got to get to the root cause of the crisis to prevent future crises. And in order to do that, we need to humanize climate change. We need to connect the long term and the short term, and we need to factor into health across all our frameworks. I think good news. We've heard a lot of good news here. Salvation comes cheap, and when we take action, we can also address inequalities, and the economics are on our side. But we still need more information, more data, and a better assessment of the full set of impacts, and really making sure that we highlight how climate solutions can drive broader gains. As for philanthropy, from its critical support for climate-related issues to that pivot to support COVID-related recovery, particularly in the absence of good governance in many countries, I think philanthropy plays an outsized role in this matter. I said it's not just because this is a global forum for philanthropy, but because philanthropy has come to play a role in facilitating and supporting innovation and also implementation that punches above its weight when it really comes to impact. So I do want to just make sure a takeaway for philanthropy today is, I think, take this moment as a challenge, but also as a learning and an opportunity to redouble efforts towards laying a path for a more sustainable future, and more inclusive future, more resilient future long term. So let's focus on solutions. Let's start from ourselves today. Let's go on this website that Christiana said, and let's make sure we all calculate our carbon count and make sure we check in every day to really help make a change and tackle these crises. With that, thank you so much, all of you, and thanks so much for being with us. And thanks again to the organizers and to my co-panelists here.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.